All right, it looks like we have a good amount here, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off today. Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Schaefer. I am the project coordinator for the National Adaptation Forum. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual monitoring and evaluation series. Today, we are going to be talking about adaptation M&E theory and practice in the natural resources and conservation sector. I'm going to say a few words here in the beginning, and then I'm going to pass it off to our session moderator, Molly, for the rest of the time. To begin with, I wanted to provide an overview of GoToWebinar, which is what we're using for our session today, so you all are just familiar with the features. In the bottom right-hand corner, you will have kind of 4 arrows facing in towards each other. This is how you can go into full screen mode. There is a raise hand feature as well. So if there's a question that you want to ask, you can raise your hand and I can take you off of mute and you can talk directly to our presenters. And then we also have a questions tab. So if you click on the questions tab, you can type in your questions, send them off, and then those will be answered at the end during our Q&A session. In addition, we are using something called a Padlet throughout this series. And so this is really just a place where we can collect resources on monitoring and evaluation. And so I will send that link out as soon as I'm done with my introduction here. But first I wanted to go through kind of how to navigate the Padlet itself. So in order to add a new comment, you will press this plus pink sign, or this pink plus sign in the bottom right-hand corner. A new note will pop up. You can write in the bottom. You can add attachments, whether that's a link, maybe a PDF, a photo, and then you can publish that. And like I said, we've been using this throughout the series. It's already populated with quite a few materials from our first 2 sessions. And this is really supposed to just be a resource that you can go back to for information on monitoring and evaluation. Now, I also wanted to highlight that this session is the 3rd session in a 4-part series. If you missed the first 2 sessions of the series, the recordings are available online at our website, which is nationaladaptationforum.org. The 4th session in this series will take place on Wednesday, April 27th. But I do want to note that a separate Zoom registration link is needed for that session. So if you've registered for these 3 sessions, you will need to complete that separate registration for that session. And that registration is posted to our website. And I will also note that that session is going to be capped at 100 participants. So if you're very interested in participating in that, you'll want to make sure you go register now. Now, the final thing that I want to share with you all is a poll link. So we had some issues with our GoToWebinar registration. So I wanted to make sure that I collected some information about who our audience is, who's tuning into this session today. So the survey that I just sent out in the chat here asked 3 questions: the type of organization that you represent, it asks some demographic information, and then where you're tuning in from. So we'd very much appreciate if you could just take a minute to fill out this survey. This is completely optional, and I do want to emphasize that all answers will be kept anonymous. So I'm just going to hang tight here for a second and let you all fill out this survey. For anyone who's just joined, I will put that survey link in the chat one more time. And again, this is just really important for us to understand who's attending our events. Are we reaching our target audience? And if we're not, how can we improve? Okay, and with that, I will pass it off to our moderator, Molly Cross.
Great, thanks so much, Carrie, for kicking things off and getting us all oriented. And special thanks to everybody who's joining us today. We're really excited to share with you some of what we're seeing and learning about monitoring and evaluation efforts for adaptation projects within the natural resources and conservation sector. Our experience largely comes through our work running what's called the Climate Adaptation Fund, which is a grant program that supports on-the-ground adaptation projects designed to benefit wildlife and ecosystems in a changing climate. I'll provide a little bit more of an introduction to the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund grant program and our sort of focus on M&E efforts within that program in a minute. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lauren Oakes, who is a conservation scientist with the Forest and Climate Change Program at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And Lauren will share more details about what we are seeing and thinking about with respect to how do we evaluate adaptation outcomes within conservation projects and what we're seeing happening within that community in terms of monitoring and evaluation efforts within our portfolio of funded projects. And then we'll have the great pleasure of hearing from two of our Climate Adaptation Fund grant partners. Liz Chamberlin, who's the Director of Strategic Innovations at Point Blue Conservation Science, will share some examples of their work on adaptation monitoring and evaluation in California. And Joy Brown, who's the Marine Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy in South Carolina, will talk about some of their adaptation monitoring and evaluation work in the coast of South Carolina. And then we'll get to come back to you all and hear some questions from the audience for this panel of speakers. So we should have about 20 to 30 minutes of time for Q&A and moderated discussion at the end. So with that, Carrie, I'm going to ask if you can allow me to share my slides. And like I said, I'll kick things off with a short introduction to the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund and some of our thinking on monitoring and evaluation within that program. Oops. So in 2011, the Climate Adaptation Fund was established by the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation in response to shared concerns that we had about how climate change was impacting our conservation efforts in the United States, both direct impacts of climate change on biodiversity, but also concerns about the ways that climate change can undermine the outcomes that we're striving for when we're implementing conservation projects. So we came together to create the Climate Adaptation Fund to support conservation nonprofits working in the United States to implement projects that are designed to help wildlife and ecosystems and the people who depend on or operate in relationship with those natural systems, help them adapt to the impacts of a changing climate. So now we've been running this program for a little over 10 years, and it's given us a really interesting opportunity to both step back and look at and learn from all of the adaptation work that we've supported over the last just over 10 years. So since 2011, we've invested over $24 million in over 120 projects, which, as you can see from this map, span many different parts of the United States, and also are operating in different ecological systems and addressing a wide range of climate change challenges. So it's a really great group of projects to try to really learn from who is doing what with respect to climate adaptation in the United States. And here today, we'll specifically focus in on who's doing what with respect to monitoring and evaluation of their adaptation projects. So given that we've been running this program for about a decade, in the last 2 years, we've been stepping back and taking a look at what we've learned over that decade and kind of brought a little bit of a refresh to our grant program. And in doing so, really decided to double down on the aspects of monitoring and evaluation within climate change adaptation projects in the US. And we're doing that by implementing 3 main grant-making strategies. A big priority for our program is to try to increase and advance innovation within the space of adaptation for conservation projects. But the piece that connects especially with monitoring evaluation is our goal of really trying to rapidly accelerate our learning around climate adaptation. The scope and scale and sense of increasing urgency around climate change requires that we also step up the scope and scale and pace at which we are actually implementing adaptation projects. And so being able to move more quickly from testing innovative ideas to really learning what we can about their effectiveness to then determine which strategies are really ready and ripe for being scaled up to much broader adoption. So that brings us to our third strategy of really trying to mainstream and broaden the adoption of demonstrated adaptation approaches. So we've tried to really embrace these goals in our grant making strategy. And we do that by giving out awards in 2 different grant categories. Since the beginning of our program, since 2011, we have been investing in adaptation implementation projects. Projects that are designed with the best available climate science information in mind and have gone through the planning process. And we support the on-the-ground implementation of adaptation actions. And so we're continuing to support adaptation implementation projects in a sort of refresh of our grant program. But we've also added a second new category to our grant making, adaptation mainstreaming grants that support the broader adoption of a demonstrated adaptation approach. Something else that's new about our program is within the adaptation work that we're funding, we now require projects include a monitoring and evaluation plan and activities during their 3-year grant period. Since the beginning of the grant program, we've always had an interest and tried to encourage monitoring and evaluation of the projects that we were supporting, but never until last year did we require that every project have a monitoring and evaluation plan. We would ask questions in our application about what are your intentions with respect to monitoring and evaluation, but now we actually require it. And so again, we've decided to really invest more heavily in this area and in order to accelerate the learning and move ideas from testing into implementation more quickly. Within our applications, we are looking for monitoring plans that are not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but that are specifically designed to help inform adaptive management of projects during the course of their implementation, and to ultimately assess the effectiveness of those actions at achieving longer-term adaptation outcomes. Obviously, during a 3-year project, we're not necessarily able to get at those longer-term outcomes. So we're looking to see how applicants describe their monitoring and evaluation plans in terms of at least measuring some interim or near-term progress towards those longer outcomes. I want to make sure that I also pause and acknowledge that by increasing our expectations and requirements around monitoring and evaluation, that can have an impact on the number and diversity and types of organizations that might feel well suited to apply to our grant program, since not every organization has experience in doing that kind of monitoring and evaluation work, or may not have the capacity internally, may not yet have the external partners that can help them do that work. And so we have included in our grant program opportunities for groups that are eligible to sort of raise their hand and say, we could use some additional monitoring and evaluation coaching to help them develop those plans. And as a side note, I'll just put out a little bit of an advertisement. If you are a monitoring and evaluation expert and are interested in the possibility of working with the Climate Adaptation Fund to help support some of this M&E coaching work, we have a call out for proposals, a terms of reference for this work. And so I encourage you to either reach out to myself or to my colleague Liz Tully to learn more. So with that, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an introduction to the grant program, explain how we have been thinking about monitoring and evaluation and how monitoring and evaluation of adaptation projects has kind of grown in its importance within our grant program to where we are now. And I want to turn it over now to my colleague Lauren Oakes so that she can share a little bit more of the details of what we've been thinking about and seeing and learning about monitoring evaluation within our grant program and our portfolio. So Lauren, if you want to turn on your video, I will turn mine off and hand it over.
Thanks, Molly. Let me just go to presenter view here. All right, well, thanks for the introduction, and I'll jump in here. I'm going to be talking about a recent study conducted with the Climate Adaptation Fund portfolio that Molly has kindly introduced, and this has been an effort to learn how we can strengthen our monitoring, evaluation, and conservation adaptation practice. And as you can see from what Molly shared about our new funding streams, we've already been putting some of what we've learned into action with the fund. So for many regions, climate change impacts are not a distant future event. Rather, they are being felt in the present. Moving forward efficiently relies on understanding implementation to date and on documenting past and current efforts and assessing their effectiveness. Practitioners, funders, and governments alike all stress the importance of tracking progress and outcomes of adaptation initiatives. But evaluating conservation outcomes has always been difficult. Monitoring programs can be ineffective or fail, for example, due to the absence of driving questions, poor study design, failure to properly articulate what indicators to monitor, and a lack of funding to maintain long-term efforts. Climate change adds yet another complexity. Climate change is a long-term and dynamic process. It affects the effects of interventions may not be apparent for decades. So whereas assessing mitigation outcomes generally relies upon one indicator, the balance of greenhouse gas emissions to and removals from the atmosphere, measuring progress in and outcomes of adaptation requires consideration of a lot of dimensions that cross the social and the ecological. They interact across time and space. So in the early 1990s, conservation practitioners began to focus more on monitoring and evaluation, given escalating pressures to increase whether or not actions were accomplishing what they intended to. The same can be said today in terms of climate change adaptation practice. Increasing investment in nature-based solutions and support for climate-smart conservation has elevated interest in tracking progress and assessing outcomes of adaptation efforts that aim to benefit people, ecosystems, and biodiversity under changing climate conditions. So this is the core research team that was involved in our project. We partnered with UBC and spent about a year and a half conducting this study that's had a lot of different dimensions to it. And I'll talk about a couple of them today, specifically related to monitoring and evaluation. As Molly indicated, we conducted this work using the portfolio of climate adaptation projects that were funded between 2011 and 2019. So this is our decade-long analysis of a decade's worth of work. This at the time was $19 million of funding. In most of the work I'll be talking about today, we focused on 76 projects that were actually awarded grants before 2017. That enabled us to see like a full granting cycle and also see how their monitoring and evaluation ended, what kinds of analyses they did, and have a really complete portfolio of projects to look at. So it's really an extensive data set with projects spanning a breadth of ecosystems, addressing different kinds of climate threats, and therefore providing a unique window into what practitioners are doing today and have been doing over the last decade. So what I'll be presenting on today is in kind of two parts, and I'll just put up these two papers here if you're interested in the studies or reading more. The first I'll be talking about in green, the range of criteria for evaluating success in adaptation. First, we're really interested to learn from experts in the field. What do we think of as success in adaptation, and how could we put that into a framework that could be used in practice? And second, a publication that should be out later this month looks at the use of best practices, what practitioners are monitoring and how, what might enable more comprehensive monitoring, and also what could improve monitoring and evaluation and conservation and adaptation in general. So starting off, what is the range of criteria for evaluating success in adaptation?
In this part of the study, we first conducted a lit review to look at what kinds of criteria and people are using for assessing adaptation, and then we went to expert interviews. These were with a diverse group of experts, both the social and natural sciences. They're typically recognized or highly cited authors, academics, those leading government institutions along with adaptation, involved in adaptation. And our process here was to interview them, refine our criteria that we already had in development from the literature, and then go back to them again and survey, go refine again, go back and survey again. So in the end, it ends up being like a really collaborative process where essentially the research team and 18 different experts develop a set of criteria. So from here, we came up with a few main categories that I'll present kind of sequentially here. The first is use of information. So these included criterion such as adaptive management, knowledge, monitoring, and evaluation. Knowledge, just to highlight, for example, does the adaptation project use the best available knowledge at suitable spatial and temporal scales? Second, project management. You can see a range of criterion here, including achievement of objectives, engagement and communication, financial and economic. Here, just providing you an example from engagement and communication. The adaptation project consulted, engaged, and communicated with relevant stakeholders and the general public before, during, and after its design and implementation. Next, looking at ecological and social outcomes. So this could cross a few different spaces from ecosystem functioning to people in society and wildlife and natural resources. And lastly, advancing the field of adaptation itself. So here, looking at a success criterion that has to do with capacity building, innovation and practice, mainstreaming of the adaptation actions, so other uptake, and also rules and policy change. I also just want to point out that the framework covers all aspects of project evaluation, and it's designed to address the fact that there's no one size fits all in terms of a monitoring plan for a project. They really need to be tailored at the project level to meet the project goals and objectives, and in the local context as well. Here you can see we're looking at inputs and processes and outputs, and also the outcomes that then occur over time from the actions we see in these types of projects. So in addition to evaluating success, this framework presented here could be used in other global contexts. For example, the criteria could be used to help inform the project design process by allowing project managers and partners, including local and community members, to identify critical components that should be considered at the outset. So we consider these criteria a helpful set of criteria in both design and in evaluation. And in the paper itself, we provide some tools and questions for practitioners to think about how they might tailor it to their own work. So the next steps in our research was to take these criteria and actually put it into practice. So those 4 categories that you saw with a number of criteria associated with them, we then developed questions to guide assessment in each category. And we trialed that within our portfolio of projects by conducting surveys with our grantees. What I'm going to present on today is really just using select questions from that survey data that focused on just the monitoring and evaluation component. So the questions that we address in this part of the research are: in what ways are practitioners adopting best practices from M&E and conservation? What are practitioners actually monitoring in relation to their reported outcomes? How does monitoring comprehensiveness vary in practice? And what factors enable more comprehensive monitoring? And lastly, what is the range of views that practitioners offer on what could improve M&E of adaptation actions? I won't be presenting all of this today, but I'll just give you a few highlights. So again, the methods of this part of our study, we relied upon a document review. So looking at what did projects propose in terms of their monitoring plan, and then what did they also report later in terms of the outcomes, what they actually did. We then drew from the survey. So this had an N of 30. Within that larger N of 76. So 30, we then dropped down to 30 survey respondents who filled out more information. And then we went back with follow-up interviews to clarify any discrepancies and go in depth about what we found in the surveys. So again, those surveys of the grantees come from just one question, one section of the larger survey structure that we designed. So a few highlights from our results. 66% of projects described elements of a theory of change, conceptual model, or results within their monitoring plan. But only a third of these projects, so just about 20% overall, clearly detailed linkages between inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and closely tied the monitoring plans accordingly. 84% of the 76 projects reported social outcomes at their project completion, in addition to the ecological outcomes, which they all had. But the use of indicators to assess these social outcomes really lagged. Only about 15% planned to collect data related to the social outcomes. We also took a look at monitoring comprehensiveness. So we developed a scoring system to assess the comprehensiveness. In this, we included the use of a question-driven approach or a theory of change, the clarity of purpose in their planning, the indicators and baseline data used, the completion of monitoring, and whether or not they had a monitoring plan after the project completion to continue seeing how things unfolded. And what we found, you can see on the top here is the results. So on the far end, not comprehensive in red or pink, and then dark blue being highly comprehensive, and the range that we saw across the data set at the top. So in general, we found that most were doing pretty well, comprehensive or highly comprehensive. The point that I want to highlight today and bring out was that we found that academic partnerships, so partnering with an external research arm, was really helpful in making those monitoring plans more comprehensive or more rigorous. And this also mirrors what we found in our interviews and what people shared with us about the role that partnerships played. So partnerships were most commonly discussed as a primary enabling factor for comprehensive monitoring efforts and effective monitoring. And interviews noted a breadth of benefits that came from these types of partnerships. So those could include, for example, consistency in data collection, bolstering capacity for analysis, rigorous design, and really engaging more people in adaptation and adaptation practice. So what could improve monitoring and evaluation and adaptation? This draws again from our interviews, as well as some of the survey data. And we separated this into two groups, practitioners and funders. And you can see here some recommendations that came. So first, developing partnerships early and leveraging partnerships, embedding monitoring operations as a standard and practice in an organization. So participants talked about having it be an arm of an organization where you're constantly, even a full staff time is dedicated to just monitoring of all projects. Use monitoring for proof of concept and using monitoring for learning by doing and adaptive management, not just the endpoint evaluation. And on the funder side, some of the recommendations included extending the project timeline and/or offering continued support for monitoring, increasing flexibility to account for challenges along the way. So oftentimes projects that faced challenges in their monitoring were associated with actually changes in weather conditions or climate or weather conditions locally, like flooding or delays in getting to their sites. So having a more flexible plan that can accommodate for those challenges would be helpful. Asking monitoring partners to share information directly with funders so that there's a really clear line between the partners and the granting organization or the funder. And lastly, having funders require monitoring and actually allocating funding directly to that. So although we found evidence of best practices from M&E and conservation being used, such as connecting indicators to a theory of change or a driving question, the fact that relatively few practitioners discussed both in their monitoring plans or tightly linked their indicators to expected long-term outcomes suggests there's some room for improvement. CAF projects often include co-benefits for people, but these social outcomes were generally not tracked throughout the project implementation nor evaluated at the end. So this is worthwhile to also note for the growing field of nature-based solutions, as such initiatives will also require innovation in tracking social outcomes over time. And lastly, we found that the benefits of partnerships with academic researchers, this also emerged from interviews and agency partners. Developing partnerships early in the project can help strengthen monitoring efforts. And with that, I will stop and turn the screen over to our next. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, and I'll encourage folks, if you've got questions based on what Lauren just presented, feel free to start, put those questions into the question field on the GoToMeeting, and we will come back around to questions after we've heard from all the speakers. But up next, I'm happy to turn it over to Liz Chamberlin. Go ahead and take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Molly. All right. I'm hoping that you can see my screen now, and if you can't, since I can't see you, that someone will let me know. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Chamberlin, Director of Strategic Innovations with Point Blue Conservation Science. And I'm happy to be here today to talk a bit about our approach to monitoring and evaluation across several of our climate adaptation funded projects that we have been working on with WCS over the past couple of years. Point Blue, first of all, we are a mid-sized, mission-driven conservation science nonprofit. We are based in California. We like to say that we work from Alaska to Antarctica and across California and the entire Pacific Flyway. So our staff consists of research scientists, restoration practitioners, data analysts and engineers, and educators. And so collectively, we are focused on science partnerships and outreach, working to promote climate smart conservation and nature-based solutions for wildlife and people. Our approach to monitoring and evaluation, I'll talk a little bit about that from an organizational perspective, and then I'll talk about it specifically as relates to our climate adaptation fund projects in a couple of case studies. Because we initiated as a bird observatory, we have a foundational perspective that monitoring is important. And then we have over 50 years of experience in evolving our approach to how we use monitoring to evaluate projects and become more effective at what we do along the way. So we believe that monitoring should reflect the goals of the project, and our goals in a broad sense include both science and storytelling. We want to be able to use our monitoring data to adaptively manage and improve our projects, assess effectiveness, and increase our impact as we go. And we also use our monitoring to inspire more projects. We do that both through developing data-driven products that we can use to show the value of the projects that we're doing in a way that is effective to communicate with people. And we also want to be able to use our monitoring approaches also to engage people in the projects themselves, since we work with a diverse array of partners, including landowners and land stewards of California's vast private lands networks. We're interested in both performance and validation monitoring metrics. So for instance, we have an active community-based restoration arm with 30 years of experience implementing more than 50 restoration projects a year across California. And they monitor both plant survival, so performance-related metrics, but also we try to assess indicators of return of ecosystem function and things like monitoring bird use as well to look at how the ecosystem responds. Here in this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on ecological outcomes, and I think Carrie's going to post a poll asking about ecological monitoring indicators at some point. There it goes into the chat for all of you. But I do want to acknowledge, as Lauren said, all of these projects also involved social indicators, and we did track those as well with these, including how we engage stakeholders in the results of these projects as we went along. So the three projects I'll talk about today, these are all climate adaptation funded projects, and two of them were led by Point Blue, and on the third one, we're a partner. So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge all of the vast expertise that are involved in these projects here. So I'm going to talk about our 2018 CAF award, which we call Drought Tolerant Oaks, the PI Blair McLaughlin at Hampshire College, and then a Point Blue team, a large team of us involved in this project. Second, I'll talk about our 2019 Climate Adaptation Fund Award, which is inoculant-supported restoration. That's led by Point Blue's soil ecologist extraordinaire, Dr. Chelsea Carey. and along with in partnership with our restoration team. And then finally, I'll talk about a project that's just getting underway, biostimulants for post-fire recovery, super important topic in the West, as I'm sure many of us are aware. And that project Point Blue is an important partner on, and it's led by a nonprofit colleague of ours, Co-Renewal, with PI Mia Maltz. So I'll talk about all three of these projects. And one thing that I want to note here, highlighting what a key indicator that Lauren mentioned as well, all of them rely heavily on the importance of partnerships. Okay, so I'll start off talking about this project, our 2018 award, which was Adapting to Drought, Building Genetic Resilience to Climate Change into Oak Woodland Systems. Many of you probably see a photo like this and associate it closely with California for a good reason. Oak woodlands are one of California's most iconic landscapes, so they have huge aesthetic and cultural value, and also really, really important places for supporting biodiversity. Also interesting is that a lot of the blue oaks, which I'll talk about today, we'll focus on today, these mostly occur in California on private lands. And that makes the importance of partnerships with entities like resource conservation districts and the NRCS, land trusts, and private landowners throughout California really important to being able to implement and sustain the monitoring and evaluation of this project. So the main target of this project was to help California's endemic blue oaks adapt to warmer and drier climates. So here you can see with the map on your screen that shows both roughly the extent of blue oaks in California, and we like to attractively call that they form sort of a bathtub ring around the Central Valley of California. And this also shows the distribution of our sites for this project. So we had both planting and xeric acorn collection sites shown on the screen. So what we expect from climate projections is that the warmer, drier climate that you see at the xeric edge, roughly the southern extent of this range, will move north, and that the xeric populations that you see there in the south will experience diebacks and even local extinction. And you can see a picture of dieback in blue oaks at the xeric edge there on your screen. And a problem with that, one of the problems with that, is that we think that xeric edge or the trailing edge contains important genetic diversity that could help the remaining population adapt to climate change. And so we want to preserve that genetic diversity. So that leads to our adaptation strategy. In 2018, we initiated a pilot project that consisted of, and this is a mouthful, what we call a participatory, dispersed, and chaperone dispersed field gene bank for endemic California blue oaks. An issue here is that oaks have recalcitrant seeds, which means when we want to preserve genetic diversity, we can't turn to sort of traditional techniques like seed banks because these seeds just won't be kept that way. And so what do we have to do? We need to plant them. And so what we've done here is established a chaperoned dispersed field gene bank as a set of 23 dispersed common garden experiments that pair local and xeric or trailing edge seeds. And so I'm skipping methods here just for the use of time and going straight into focusing on what we monitored and how we evaluated it. Because I could spend quite a lot of time talking about all three of these projects, but we'll try to stick within the 15 minutes that we have here. So one of our questions was, of course, a straightforward question. Would these xeric edge transplants survive the initial climate mismatch when we planted them into their dispersed field gene bank? So we monitored here, to answer that question, survival and growth. And a key takeaway is that it's encouraging. The results were encouraging. You can see in red the drought tolerant or the xeric edge oaks, and in blue are the local acorns and how they survived. But for the red bars, the xeric edge oaks, they had strong survival and fairly good growth. And so we're encouraged that this field gene bank will work to help preserve genetic diversity. And you can also see, though, that xeric transplants had lower survival and growth compared to the local seedlings. And so that's also an important part of the story. And it was important that we had additional monitoring indicators to help build this story through this project. So in addition to survival and growth, we also monitored resistance to herbivory and disease. And here we were interested in questions around whether there might be trade-offs between growth and drought tolerance that could confer future potential adaptive advantages with climate change. So of course, we were interested in that as well. And a key takeaway here is that there may in fact be trade-offs where local seeds have invested in rapid growth and xeric transplants could be adapted to allocate resources to predation and disease resistance, which may confer adaptive benefits long-term, especially under climate stressful situations. In evaluating this project, it's important that we monitored indicators related to both initial performance and adaptation to start building a clearer picture of the entire story. But a key takeaway here is that ongoing monitoring will be critical. And one way that we sustain our monitoring efforts long-term, as at Point Blue, we do see a critical importance in long-term perspectives and long-term monitoring is through our dispersed staff and partnerships that we have throughout the state and project area. So here up on the screen, you can see a map of a subset of our staff. These are part of our working lands team. We call them our partner biologists. They are embedded in NRCS field offices throughout the state, and they themselves have deep expertise and deep partnerships in the systems that they work with, including private landowners and ongoing projects on the various lands through which we have our dispersed field gene bank. And this allows them to, even post funding of the discrete project that we have here, they can help us continue to monitor the progress of this project so that we can evaluate outcomes as we go. And as you know, it's probably obvious, but oaks are very long-lived species on the order of hundreds of years. So monitoring for 2 years is a great start, but we are working to sustain this project into the long term to really evaluate the impacts on oak adaptation in California. The second case study I'll talk about our monitoring approach in today is inoculant-supported restoration. It also takes place in California's arid rangeland ecosystems and primarily on private lands as well. Many of you are probably familiar with mycorrhizal associations, but just in case you're not, mycorrhizae are important plant partners. They're fungal soil partners in the roots that help plants access essential nutrients in exchange for carbon. And really importantly, these fungal partners, especially that are associated with woody species, consist of a type of mycorrhizae called ectomycorrhizae that associate with the outside plant roots. And that is important for our purposes because this type of mycorrhizae is not likely to exist in the soil on its own at many restoration sites. And that makes ectomycorrhizae a key candidate for this technique that we wanted to test of inoculant-supported restoration. And so we had a couple of questions for this experiment, and these were, can the soil inoculum increase the plant ectomycorrhizal association? So does it work if you inoculate soil? Do the ectomycorrhizae associate with plant roots? And further, do those associations increase plant survival and vigor for our restoration plants? And our second question was, does that, related to adaptation, does that soil inoculum, if it's sourced from warmer, drier climates, like the kind we anticipate seeing in the future, does that increase plant survival and vigor compared to inoculum sourced from local sources? And so we chose 3 species to test this technique on. These species are woody species that we typically use in our riparian restorations with Point Blue. So these are oaks, willow, and Douglas fir. And so what we monitored for this project included fairly simple indicators: oak germination, plant survival, and root colonization with the ectomycorrhizal partners. And for evaluating the results of this project, we had some pretty clear evidence to start with. So first of all, there's strong evidence that the technique more than tripled the odds. Sorry, my screen is flipping out. My screen more than tripled the odds of survival of willow and coast live oak. And arroyo willow and coast live oak had higher rates of association with ectomycorrhizae partners. Odds of acorn germination doubled for coast live oak. And really importantly, there was no evidence that we have seen yet of any negative effects associated with the technique. But again, ongoing monitoring will be important. And that ongoing monitoring will be important both to continue to assess the impacts of the technique on adaptation benefits, but also to help mitigate any risk that could develop associated with this technique. Okay, and then my final case study that I'm just going to touch on today, because this project is just getting underway, is the effects of microbial inoculation on post-fire community resilience and recovery. So this was an award from just this year, and it's led by co-renewal in partnership with Point Blue. And again, as many of us know, the effects of wildfire in the West are devastating, and so developing techniques to help aid post-fire recovery is a priority in this region. So here you can see on your screen a photo of what are called wattles. These are cylindrical structures that are often used post-fire to help prevent erosion of dangerous post-fire toxins and pollutants flushing into waterways particularly. And in this case, we're using treatments that include just those typical erosion control wattles on their own, but we're also inoculating wattles with soil microbial partners that can help, we suspect, can help aid post-fire recovery by doing things like helping remove heavy metals and other pollutants that are in the soils. And so for this project, we had some pretty simple main questions. Can these inoculants help regenerate ecosystems post-fire? And can we optimize this technique through what we're learning to achieve maximum benefits? Now here I wanted to talk about the monitoring approach just a bit because it's a little bit different than what you might have seen in the previous two case studies. It's a little bit more complex. So we're looking at microbial structure that we're monitoring, so diversity and composition, and that requires specialized techniques like DNA sequencing. And we're also looking at indicators of ecosystem recovery, and some of those indicators are listed there. And what's interesting about this is that we had to take a more complex approach here because we're looking at below ground components of the system. When you're looking at above ground components, it's a little more straightforward and we have a lot more experience in what we need to monitor in order to assess the outcomes that we're interested in. And in this case, when we're looking below ground, it's sort of a new frontier. And so one of our actual outcomes that we're interested in with this project is to improve monitoring indicators themselves. So we're hoping through the design of this project that we can help identify microbial indicators that we can monitor below ground. And so that will help illuminate the trends we're interested in. And in the future, we'll be able to identify particular indicators that are most important to monitor to help simplify monitoring approaches with projects like this one as we head into the future. So a couple of takeaways I wanted to highlight here before I wrap up is that across all of these projects, and I think this echoes as well what Lauren and Molly talked about, the monitoring is most effective when not designed in a vacuum. It's really important that we can learn adaptively across time and projects, and often that requires thinking really early about how you can integrate the monitoring results of discrete projects in order to learn from all of them and improve performance over time. Often we find that simple is best, especially for sustaining long-term monitoring. That leads to my next point. We all know that long-term monitoring is necessary, and it's also really challenging from a resource sense to, it can be labor intensive, it can be expensive to sustain. And so the simpler and the more accessible the protocols and the techniques used, especially when they don't require specialized equipment too long into the future, or specialized techniques, that can help sustain your ability to monitor projects into the long term and follow them as you really need to with adaptation projects to understand the impacts that you're having. And as all of us, I'm sure, are aware, funding for long-term monitoring can be a challenge. And so we sometimes have to be creative and employ things like our dispersed staff networks and partners to help aid in our long-term monitoring efforts. And so with that, I'd like to thank a lot of people who are involved in these three great projects and pass off to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to hear about all the different projects you guys have underway. And I'm pleased to turn it over to our third, last but not least, final speaker, Joy Brown from the Nature Conservancy, to share an additional sort of on-the-ground practitioner perspective on these topics. Thanks, Joy.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you, everyone. Carrie, actually, can I get you to start the poll question for me? And I'll have that up on the screen as I go through just my first slide here.
Yes, I can. It is launching right now.
Okay, thank you. So before I get into my presentation, I'm interested to know, does your state have a living shoreline permit? So as I speak to this first slide, if you all will answer this question so that it makes the poll go away, and then I'll have Carrie tell me the results when I'm done with my information for my first slide. So Hello, everyone. My name is Joy Brown, and I'm the Marine Program Manager for the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy. My work includes projects and community planning to support coastal resilience and mitigating flood impacts using nature-based features. And today I'll be talking about our living shoreline work in the state and how we have supported the state efforts to develop a living shoreline permitting guidance and framework so property owners have another tool in the toolbox other than gray infrastructure like seawalls to reduce erosion and support healthy marshes as we face the impacts of sea level rise and climate change along our coast. So Carrie, have we gotten some answers to the poll?
Yeah, so I can go ahead and close it out and share our results. It looks like the majority of our attendees said they don't know, and then we're evenly split between yes and no.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for doing that. I hope you might learn a little bit as we go through the presentation today. Okay, here we go. The Nature Conservancy is a global nonprofit with international and U.S. chapters with a mission to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And in an effort to develop a strategic plan to support the world's human populations, we have developed a set of conservation priorities from the global down to the state level efforts. And in the South Carolina chapter, we've developed a set of 6 strategic pillars under which all our work is couched. And today I'll be discussing work within our resilience and adaptation pillar, and to a lesser extent, the sustained fisheries pillar, but there's definitely a connection between our living shoreline projects and the fisheries, since many of our projects are oyster reef based and marsh based efforts. So the reefs and marshes along the South Carolina coast are vital in supporting a healthy marine food web, as well as the support and defense it provides for the built environment. So I was hired to establish the South Carolina chapter's marine program in 2008. Since that time, I've worked with numerous partners and funding agencies, along with hundreds of volunteers to install and monitor a set of living shoreline projects along the coast. Living shorelines, very simply put, is a shoreline stabilization method that keeps the land and water connection. So the goal of our projects are to reduce site-specific erosion, promote accretion of marsh vegetation, support the development of a state-based living shoreline permit, and widespread implementation of such projects. And our monitoring efforts range depending on funding and partnerships and contractor opportunities. But at its very core, there are some universal metrics we try to always include. Since our projects to date are oyster reef-based efforts, we have been utilizing this monitoring and assessment handbook principles. The universal metrics contained in Chapter 3 are metrics that should and can easily be monitored for all oyster reef-based projects. For our living shoreline work, we also use the Chapter 8 enhancement of adjacent habitat metrics. And while we want to see how the oyster reef we install recruits and grows oysters, we also want to know how the reef supports a healthy marsh. So we do that by measuring shoreline loss and gain, elevation, and plant cover. And I like to say that the reef is like the icing on the cupcake, but the marsh is really the cake. And our marshes are vital to the future of coastal living, and the oyster reefs help to create a healthy, resilient edge to support them from boat wakes, wind waves, and sea level rise. So now I'm going to show off a couple of our projects. The first example is the Goldbug Island Living Shoreline Project located near Sullivan's Island on the Intercoastal Waterway. The site is located between Breach Inlet and the Charleston Harbor. So it expends a lot of tidal energy and boat wakes. The pictures here are both taken at low tide. So during high tide, the reef is about 4 feet underwater. And the project was part of a multi-year Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund supported effort that started in 2013. In 2016, we installed a 225-foot long reef by 4 feet wide by 2 feet high. The materials we used were a base layer of pallets wrapped in geotextile fabric, oyster castles, and bagged oyster shell. And as you can see from the comparison photos, the reef materials have stayed in place and supported the development of new marsh vegetation, which you can note You can see here the beginning, and then here this great expanse and these little sections of marsh that have grown up. So we didn't plant any new Spartina. Just by adding the reef materials, we've slowed the water movement behind the reef, and sediments have dropped out. So by simply raising the elevation of the sediment, we have allowed the Spartina that was at the site to expand on its own. And I should also note that Spartina alterniflora is the dominant native species of marsh vegetation for the coast. Some people that may be on may consider Spartina to actually be an invasive species. So just making that clarification. So the second project I'll share is located further south along our coast near Seabrook, just off the North Edisto River. And it experiences a high amount of boat traffic. So this is commercial and recreational fish activity, but also pleasure cruising in the area. And this project was built adjacent to Botany Island in 2017, which is actually a barrier island. And it consists of 6 clusters of Oyster Castle Reef sections that are offset. And the clusters are 15 feet long by 5 feet wide by 2 feet high. The island actually experiences episodic erosional issues during events, and these events, they aren't hurricanes necessarily, rather they're strong coastal storms that cause choppy waves and extreme high tide events. So when these events occur, we believe the sand that's washed off the front and north end of the island is getting pushed into the back creeks, one of which is where our project is located. The sand versus normally it's mud, are accreting behind our project site and actually has significantly raised the elevation of the shore. This has again promoted the growth of the new vegetation. And you can see those differences here where this is this escarpment, marsh escarpment edge where the erosional pattern was occurring. And then this after picture in 2021 actually shows the new sediments that are in here with the vegetation growing in the new area. So here I'm showing some of our photos from our monitoring efforts. In the top left, you can see Andrea monitoring oyster reef growth on the Goldbug Reef during a low tide. And at the top, you can see Chris mapping the vegetation line during a high tide event. So both Andrea and Chris have been employed as our marine techs, and they have helped to organize and recruit volunteers to help us with our monitoring and install events. So to monitor oyster growth on the Goldbug project, we use a random number generator to identify 5 points along the reef. Then we lay our quarter quadrat at those 5 points. And then we want to note the size of the oysters in the quad and any boxes being dead oysters that are open. Oyster sizes are measured using calipers, measuring from the hinge to the lip. And then the weight of the oyster meat is actually the best indicator, but that requires you to actually remove the oyster from the reef and dry the meat. So instead of always taking oysters off, we leave them there. And oyster shell length is the next best method. So it's important for us to know when oyster recruitment occurs, if the oysters are growing, and if we continue to see different size classes. If so, we know that the site is healthy and continues to produce more oysters. We measure the oysters during low tide events, so we don't have to use snorkels or scuba gear. And we have very soft mud in South Carolina, and we call that fluff mud. So as you can see from the bottom right picture, Andrea is standing on one of the pallets, but I am not. So in an effort to track the vegetation growth, we wait until high tide and use GPS to outline the vegetation line sticking up out of the water using kayaks like you see Chris doing. So you can actually see Chris actually ringing that little island of grass, and the reef would be located just in front of his kayak under the water. Here you can see volunteers in action monitoring the sediment accretion in 3 different ways. So the top left is TNC staff and a volunteer monitoring the accretion of the Botany Reef. They are doing this by measuring the amount of sediment on the front and back side of the reef clusters. We normally see an exponential amount of sediment on the back side, no real change on the front side, but we have seen edge effects along those ends of those clusters. The middle picture is actually Blair Williams. He is the State Department of Health Coastal Program Permitting Manager. He's measuring the sediment accretion behind the Goldbug Island Reef and using walking boards so he doesn't sink into the fluff mud while doing that. We actually installed stainless steel poles to resistance down into the marsh mud behind the reef at time of install, and then we measure the amount of poles sticking out at that time. And so with every new monitoring, we measure how much of the pole remains out of the mud. And in the picture on the right is Katie Luciano, who works for the Department of Natural Resources Geological Services. She installed sediment tiles when we put in a bag shell reef at the site, this site, which is named Oak Point, which was installed in 2014. This was the second project funded by the Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund. I mentioned that also supported the Goldbug project. Katie's holding this sediment tile with a mass amount of mud. She had to actually dig the tile out because we thought it would wash away. So in this case, we saw a surge of these finer sized silt sediments within the first 3 months after install, and then minor amounts settling out over the remaining first year. So typically on our projects, we see this initial surge, but it can vary in depth of these finer silts. And then within 3 years, we see those smaller grain size particles overtop with larger grain sizes to sand size particles. And this is normally when we see that forward movement of that spartina vegetation. And here you can see the maps of the vegetation line changes. The images note the vegetation edge at install and then that forward movement over the years. So on the left is the Goldbug project. We have seen 75 to 100 feet movement towards the reef in 5 years. The range is changed due to where the initial vegetation line started. So you can see on the left side, that's the further end of the original vegetation edge. We think that was due to kind of a circulating pattern closer to the fill that they used to create this access to their boat ramp. The 75-foot movement is actually on the further end from that edge, and it actually started out here. And then the peak dots is the little island of marsh that has popped up closer to the reef. There's always a section of higher elevation that develops right behind and in the middle of the reef structure initially. And we assume we will see the new marsh edge combined with the islands and fully fill in the years to come. So on the right side is the botany project. In 4 years, vegetation has actually moved all the way to the back of cluster 3. And the clusters have actually been adjusted forward slightly due to those surges of sand filling in on the back sides. And I should note the green line marked the vegetation line in 2017. Here it is. But that line had actually bumped back between the first time we marked this site in early 2017 and the time we got our permits and installed the clusters in August. So our projects have been fed into the effort to develop a living shoreline permit for the state. The Department of Natural Resources partnered with the Department of Health to study their existing projects and install some new ones using a set of defined materials. In that study, they also looked at TNC built reefs. And with our experience and knowledge of how our projects have been responding along the South Carolina coast, that gave us a seat at the table to be one of the main players with a say in how that first permit guidance was developed. So we continue to be involved, and since the permit was created in May of 2021, we're still working with partners on education. We initially led the team to develop the Clemson website of educational resources, and a part of our group led by Clemson to create and implement a contractor training for South Carolina. I will be the trainer on how to install and monitor oyster castle projects, including a how-to video and field day experience, and that training is coming online this fall. In that education effort, we've also developed a living shoreline siting app for the South Carolina coast to help property owners determine if their shoreline is appropriate for a living shoreline project. The app is the first stop shop for property owners, and it also helps them to prepare for their pre-application meetings with permitting agencies. The siting is based on energy categories of wind wave, boat weight, and max fetch energy. There's also a supplemental data that we link to that includes the Department of Health shoreline change rate and Department of Natural Resources oyster harvest areas. So property owners can zoom into their specific address, see the energy categories and any supplemental information. Then they can print that out and use that in their pre-application meetings. And in those meetings, that map can actually, and information can help the permitting agencies suggest materials if their property owners unsure what might work for them. So we have also note existing living shoreline projects as case studies so that property owners can see those projects near them. And that includes the set of all the TNC projects and then those case studies from that DNR research that I mentioned earlier. And our work to date has been based on parcel-sized projects. While we continue to support coast-wide parcel-sized projects through our education efforts, our implementation strategy has changed to one of scaling up in terms of size. And we're now looking to use the knowledge we've gained over the past 10+ years for installing and monitoring our projects to site and implement acre-sized projects. And the project you see here is a draft design for the Boyd Living Shoreline project in downtown Georgetown. And while this is not wholly an oyster reef-based project, we are using our experience to try new wood materials to support this community-based project. And monitoring has been contracted with a local university, the Coastal Carolina University, and the professors are using their students to monitor baseline immediately at install and long-term changes to the site. There's a set of physical and biological data that's being collected. Dr. Gaze is working with a drone to measure elevation around the peninsula and on our project site. Map the vegetation and use side scan sonar for bathymetry mapping. And Dr. Walters is using gill nets, crab pots, and minnow traps, along with recruitment tiles to access the biological activity at the site. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time and look forward to answering any questions you may have at the end.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you so much for sharing about your work. If I could have all the speakers turn on their videos so we can have a little bit more of like a panel discussion feeling here. Thank you, guys. So thanks so much to all of you for the really great presentations. I thought it was really nice to have some of the general big picture insights that Lauren shared about, how do we sort of wrap our heads around what it means to evaluate adaptation projects outcomes and success, to a broad picture of what conservation practitioners are doing in terms of M&E for adaptation, and then to hear a couple of real specific on the ground stories was really, I think, really nice to help ground it in the realities of what actually is going on the ground. So I want to remind folks that you can type in your questions into the question box in the GoToMeeting control panel. And so, and if speakers also want to, I think for us to see the questions, just so you know, Carrie is pasting them into that shared Google Doc that we've been using to just organize the session. I thought that I might actually start with a question for you all, if I can take the liberty of being moderator here and step off a little bit from what you were just talking about, Joy, that idea of going from single site level, site-based work to a larger scale. And something that we've been thinking about a lot within the Climate Adaptation Fund program, as I mentioned, we have now implementation grants as well as what we call mainstreaming grants. And a question that we've been grappling with at the fund is, when is the evidence base supporting an adaptation approach adequate to maybe begin to encourage much broader, larger scale adoption of a practice? And so I thought maybe, Joy, because you were sort of just talking about that very topic, I thought maybe I would love to hear just some of your thoughts on that question. And then Liz would love to hear from your guys' perspective at Point Blue, how you guys think about that question of balancing, when is enough information, when do we have enough information to warrant some broader scaling up of an approach? So Joy.
Sure. So in our case in South Carolina, we actually, when we realized it was something that was necessary, because when we started doing our living shoreline projects, we were using fill permits, and so we were having to kind of square peg round hole the situation, and it felt like the more projects we started doing, there became a real interest from property owners, right? So when property owners started calling the state and saying, how do I do this? That's when we saw a real interest by our permitting agencies. And so it was something that we had been doing in practice, and DNR had been doing in practice even longer than us in the state. So we already knew that we had a great set of data. But in South Carolina, it's very specific to South Carolina data. We can pull in information from other states, but the question always becomes, how does that happen in South Carolina? What works in South Carolina? And so we knew we had a nice kind of baseline foundation of data, but then there was a needed to have a directive from the state to collect real-time data that could go into a best management practice. And so at that point, between the Nature Conservancy projects and all the work DNR had done since the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a really nice amount of data that there was to look at, and then compare with some real-time short-term projects that were installed over just a few years and monitored. Mm-hmm. So while I don't think the few projects that would have been installed over those few years to be monitored really would have been enough, I felt like us knowing that we had, on the up to like 20 projects and over, 20 years of data, coupled with that real private property owner interest and need, is really what pushed us to that point to say, this is the time that we have to have this permit. We have to be able to go and implement on a much broader scale. And we're just seeing impacts, I think. Property owners, that was one thing. They were stating, I am seeing my marsh, I'm losing 50 foot with every storm. We have to be able to do something. So for us, I feel like those were kind of some of the triggers that was able to take it to the next level.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that example. Yeah, Liz, do you have any thoughts on this question as well?
Yeah, I think just to think about it broadly, to just take a step back from that great answer, I think in a broad sense, it has to do with what do you understand about the risks and benefits associated with the project? So it's a little bit of, I don't think there's one right answer, but there's a comfort zone thing there. I think some people are optimists, for lack of a better way to put it, and some are pessimists. But to put it into a more specific framework, I think it's time to mainstream when you feel that you have a clear understanding of what the risks are. And that's step one. And then some projects are pretty clear win-wins. Like it might be hard to see negative impacts for certain projects. Others might have a little bit of risk associated with them. And so there's two elements that are really important in those situations. And one is long-term monitoring. So you need to monitor the effects of the projects and have a plan for mitigating risk. And I know that within the WCS CAF, the Climate Adaptation Fund, that's something that we talk about at the proposal stage. And I think that's really important. And the other element that's important is one that you also focus on, and that's mainstreaming through direct communication. So as you're learning, I really like this model because as you're learning, you're also communicating, and that gives a chance to incorporate other perspectives on risk that might be occurring that you hadn't thought about, and be able to mitigate those through monitoring the effects of the project as it goes. So I think it really depends on your understanding of the universe of risk associated with the project.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue, Liz, to a question that came in from the audience that I think is great because it's kind of some of these sort of, somebody who's interested in hearing perspectives on two big monitoring and evaluation challenges, both of which you just touched on to some degree. The first being maintaining long-term monitoring on systems with long response times, especially when grants, including for our program, have relatively short timeframes. Again, we took the big and bold step of moving our grants from 2-year grants to 3-year grants. We obviously fully understand that that does not lead to long-term monitoring and evaluation. So yeah, I'd be happy to speak to it from the grantor's perspective, but I would love to hear from you guys as grantees. And then the second one, being honestly evaluating and learning from outcomes that don't meet project goals as they were originally planned. I think there's a great underappreciation probably within lots of fields, but certainly within conservation about the importance of learning from failures, things that don't go as planned. And, we certainly try to include language in our call for proposals and in our engagement with grantees that encourages sharing of those stories. We also fully understand there's the power dynamic there that makes it very difficult for grant partners to talk about things that maybe didn't go well. So would love to hear, Liz, given that you were kind of touching a little bit on both those things, if you have any other additional thoughts you want to share on that. And then Joy, would love to hear from you. And then maybe Lauren, from the perspective of a funder, kind of thinking about that as well.
Sure. I mean, those are excellent questions. I think, first of all, I agree. Those are the right questions to be asking. I think thinking about how do we sustain projects and how do we communicate failure, those are both really, really important in learning from each other and mitigating risk associated with these types of projects, especially around something like a concept like adaptation, where, as I know you've noted, there's not one universal, accepted view of what success in adaptation is. So I think it's really important to be able to communicate project failures. There is the dynamic that people are worried about doing that with funders, but I think the more that funders are willing to say, hey, let's communicate about our failures too, that will help grantees feel comfortable in doing so. So that's maybe one quick answer. And in terms of long-term, the way we sustain our projects long-term, for our organization, that is something fundamental to our perspective. We take a long-term view. And so we do, try to get into these projects as possible for the long haul. But of course, as you noticed, or you commented on as well, the reality is funding long-term monitoring is really, really difficult. And so I'm very interested in ways, to continue to have that conversation. What we do at Point Blue on a practical level, of course, we apply for additional funding. So we try to sustain our projects through a funding plan where we look for other sources of funding, recognizing one funder can't fund a project forever. That's reality too. And then, as I said, we have an interesting model where I think it's really important and unique, but because we have a dispersed staff and a dispersed network of partners, it's really critical to how we sustain projects. So we can be out on a ranch, for example, working on a different project that might be funded, and because we're out there and our partners are out there, they are willing, insofar as our monitoring indicators are relatively simple and quick to collect, to go and monitor projects like our drought tolerant oaks common garden planting project. We can get people to go and monitor sort of incidentally, and that's one way that we can sustain projects long term as well too. Is leverage our diverse suite of projects and partnerships to sustain projects beyond the life of an individual discretely funded project.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Joy, I would love to hear your perspectives on how you guys try to support that longer term monitoring evaluation, and yeah, what's the culture like within TNC about learning from failures and sharing that learning?
Yeah. So I've never been able to find just a solely dedicated source of funds that would fund long-term monitoring. So we do try to write that in the objectives of our marine techs that we hire, so that when we get funding for them, it funds a broader perspective of their work. And so we're able to then utilize them to do that. But we also want to think about things like post-storm impacts. So one thing that TNC asks is, as soon as safely possible, to get out to your sites. Sometimes that's a long time. There's still boats and pieces of dock floating in the waterways months after storms around here, especially larger hurricanes. So we've actually been able to identify a set of our sites that can be accessed by land. And so we think about accessing those after storms, and maybe sometimes with drones to be able to look those up. But in general, we try to always get eyes on our projects at a minimum annually. If they're over 5 years, then every 5 years. But again, trying to put that within the marine tech budget, or just couch that under more of our general resilience and adaptation pillar. And we're fortunate to have donors that are interested and will support that kind of general work under that pillar. So that's how we kind of couch those things. But yeah, that lesson of learning from mistakes, it feels like we always talk about it, but it's not front and center most of the time. And so the specific example of living shorelines, everybody likes to point to, we have this one project that we found that there was an issue with configuration, and we found out early on it would work. So we tried to share it with everybody, but still to this day, it feels like it's the only project that everybody in the state points to of like, we're learning from our lessons of failure, that project. So I feel like while we still talk about it, there's still a need to make it feel maybe more accepted, especially as scientists. You sometimes might feel like you failed at something because it didn't work. Mm-hmm. But as a scientist, you're supposed to accept, your outcome based on your setup and learn from that and move on. So we try to share that. Specifically in South Carolina, and then in the Nature Conservancy, I think we're learning a bit more about having this open and honest, candid conversations about when projects have failed, what do we learn, and how do we move on to better ourselves from them.
Yeah. Thank you. Lauren, would you, I know also, and there was a question actually just kind of related to this about some of the work you presented, Lauren, about partnerships. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on these questions around kind of what you learned in your research about how adaptation practitioners are trying to support longer term monitoring. I imagine you're going to talk about partnerships. So there was also a question, if you wouldn't mind touching on as you share your thoughts as well, about there was a question about whether partnerships beyond traditional academic institution were also explored in the surveys and interviews as well that we conducted. And so just thought maybe you could touch on that as well.
Yeah, sure. So first to the question about partnerships with other institutions. From the survey data, we largely looked at academic partnerships, and then in interviews, we had follow-up questions around that. So we tended to use those partnerships as a proxy for other research partnerships. But in the interviews, people often spoke about, not only they often, similar to what you both have discussed, like had multiple partnerships, and then there's one other leads, and then there's two involved in monitoring with different roles. But I definitely see those as interchangeable, and seeing, an institutional as a research arm. And for those that spoke specifically to academia, like it was very clear that recommendations also need to include, like when you're building out that partnership from the beginning, like really setting what your goals are from the start, to make sure your interests are in line. Someone can have a really different timeline at an academic institution, or a different deliverable than what you're looking towards. So those recommendations were also kind of specific to just to academia. The other question in terms of, well, I guess I wanted to point to the fact that one of the other things that we had a hard time, and we have had a hard time doing with the fund, is tracking these longer term outcomes. So projects will continue, often working with partners, but then being able to get that information back to the funder 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years out, whatever it is, when they're actually published or when that study comes out, has been hard, and not something that we've done consistently. So I think that's another thing that we're thinking about at the fund is, how do we get consistent reporting back, not only from our grant partners that are the primary ones on the project, but those that may also be the primary on monitoring, both during the project duration and further out. And I guess lastly, I'd say that partnerships, that was another benefit that came from partnerships, is the resources that can be brought in for monitoring beyond the life of the grant. So I think Liz and Joy have touched upon that, but that was also what we saw in our data, like across the board.
Yeah.
Molly, I just wanted to add one thing to that. So when you were talking about partnerships with educational institutions and long-term monitoring, my hope is that with the project, like I mentioned at the end, the Boyd Living Shoreline, is that I get interest from these professors. I get them involved. It's a multi-year process, and then our funding stops. But hopefully they've already set up a baseline database, and they will continue to bring their students out to that site and think about publishing on that. So that is really a selfish interest of mine, to get them involved and invested in the project that they might want to continue long-term out there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great. It's a great example. So we just have a couple more, just a few short minutes before we need to wrap up. I thought this might actually be a good segue. There was a question posed in the Q&A about, actually it was in, during Lauren's presentation, about whether monitoring plans had changed due to landscape changes and or changes in weather patterns. And I don't know if I'm interpreting this question exactly right, but it kind of touches on that element of what happens when projects don't go as planned, and how do we learn from those situations. I know that we have examples of projects in our portfolio that encountered challenges in their implementation. I think Lauren referred to this in your presentation, Lauren, of challenges related to the weather wasn't quite right for us to be able to do the plantings that we had planned. That climate changes are affecting their ability to deliver on the projects and implement the actions they had proposed to implement at the time they had proposed, or in the places that they had originally proposed. And so we absolutely, as the funder in this case, are very interested in actually trying to, my colleague Liz Tolley, the Associate Director for the Climate Adaptation Fund, is actually trying to catalog those a little bit more regularly or in a more consistent way, in part because it is another example of how climate change impacts conservation. So, I would say, yes, we do see projects impacted by climate changes that are ongoing. And was just curious, Joy or Liz, if you had any examples of that as well, on that kind of adaptive management sort of concept of, needing to adjust your projects along the way, in part because of climate change. Maybe Liz, I'll just so you don't.
Sure, yeah. Well, in California, it's probably not a surprise that there's a variety of ways that our projects can be impacted in unexpected ways. And one of those ways, of course, is fire. So we've had projects that are impacted in terms of access to our sites or our ability to get out on the land related to smoke and fire impacts. We've had projects, sites burn post-restoration. I don't know that any of our Climate Adaptation Fund sites burned completely, but we've certainly had other funded restoration sites completely burn after, huge investments in implementing those projects. So that's one type of impact we can have. We've certainly had, I'm sure all of us are aware of COVID impacts over the past couple of years, particularly to our communications related activities. And so we've had to really alter what we do there. But not just that, there also had impacts to how we're allowed to work in the field and when we're allowed to work in the field and what we're allowed to do. And so those are some examples of types of impacts that we've had. With our ISR project that I talked about, I know that we also had something there that we talked quite a lot about with Liz Tolley from the Climate Adaptation Fund, which was we initially overestimated how many plants we could inoculate simply with the budget because it was new. So it was kind of an impact of a novel technique. We were a little bit guessing what our costs would be and what our labor would be on that. And so, so that's another example of a type of impact, is just trying to anticipate a project budget and timeline on a novel technique is also a challenge, and with not much to go on but a guess. And so with all of those, I think, I don't know if this will be exciting, but it's true. The way that we dealt with it was simply through communication, and that's something that we've had a lot of experience with the Climate Adaptation Fund over the past several years. We do a lot of talking with Liz Tolley, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk through any of those problems. As soon as they arise, we try to talk to our partners and our funders about what's going on. And I think that is the best path forward I can think about for how to deal with those impacts, simply to communicate what's going on and what's our plan for adapting.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So we need to wrap it up, but Joy, I just wanted to see if you have any kind of closing thoughts you want to share before we pass it back to Carrie to wrap it up.
Yeah, I would just quickly say with our work on the coast, it's definitely a timing game between getting your permits and putting in your materials at the right time of year so you have the best spat set, or sometimes when you are allowed or not allowed to do activities in the water based on when things like manatees are moving through. And so we were seeing some of those patterns changing. So you have to be ready to adjust. If, say, the water's not warm enough to put your project in, you have to wait till another season by the time you get your permits, or if you're ready to do your work and all of a sudden there's a mass amount of manatees in the bay, you cannot do that activity at that time. So we're learning how to adjust and roll with the punches.
Those darn manatees. I would love to be somewhere where manatees overrun my sites. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing your thoughts and ideas and the work that you're doing. I really appreciate your time and energy and what you shared with us. I know there were some questions put in the chat that were maybe a little bit more about some details on the specific projects presented. So I'll just encourage folks to reach out directly to Joy or Liz or Lauren if you've got follow-up questions. And then Carrie, thanks so much. If you hopefully, I know I didn't give you too much time to wrap things up, but thank you so much for all your help organizing the session today, Carrie. I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Molly, you just took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say, if you have any questions for our speakers, I wanted to put up the email addresses here one more time, just in case people want to follow up. So I will put that up there. And then also just have a quick reminder, we have one more session in this series that is going to be a training on developing targeted adaptation indicators and metrics. That's going to be 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, April 27th. And again, that will require a separate Zoom registration link. So go to our website, which is nationaladaptationforum.org, in order to register for that series. So that is all I have, and a big thank you to our speakers and our moderator, Molly, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.